When you're selling your house, what do you need to disclose to a buyer? I'm Aaron Chadbourne at Demetria's team, the Real Estate Group, and our team has the experience to guide you through every step of the home buying and selling process. Disclose, disclose, disclose. That's the best advice that we always give to any home seller, because under the law in the state of Maine, a home seller has to disclose any material fact that you know about the condition of the property. These are things that might affect the value or the safety of the property itself. And in Maine, what we have is a standard form, the state of Maine property disclosure that realtors provide. And when you're buying a house, you get pretty good at looking at these, reading them, and knowing what's in there. This is a guide to help you understand some of the things that might not be visible that you'd want to know about the property. Let me walk you through what pieces of information you'll want to make sure you have ready when we're going to fill out the property disclosure. Number one is your water supply. This is a question of, do you have private well or public water or some other source? There are some association or quasi-public sources, or there might be a source that services more than one property. But the majority are either going to be public water, which is Portland Water District or another water company, or you're going to have a private well. That's going to be the majority. If you have public water, that's kind of the end of the inquiry. If you've ever had any problems with it, we need to know them. If you have a private well, we're going to need to know, have you ever had it tested? Have you ever had any problems? Have you had any problems with the quantity? Does it run dry? Have you had any problems with the quality? Have you had it tested? Is there anything that came back that was a health or safety risk? We're also going to want to know about your well pump and whether or not there's ever been a problem with that mechanical component. But at the end of the day, you need to share what you know. There's no requirement that you have your water tested, so that if you don't know and you've never had it tested, that's not something you're required to do. A buyer can do that during their investigation. But if you have had it tested and there are things you know about, you need to disclose. You're going to notice a theme. That's always going to be the recommendation. If there's anything you know, disclose, disclose, disclose. That protects you from liability in the future, and it gives the buyer full information in making decisions about your house. Section 2 has to do with waste disposal, so the septic or the public sewer. Again, if you have public sewer, this is an easier question to answer. The thing that we want to know is, have you had any malfunctions and have you had that sewer line inspected? Septic inspectors have a camera that goes on a snake that they can run through your sewer line out to where it connects in the street and see if there are any sags, if there are any leaks, if there's any blockages. Those are things that a buyer might look at. And if you've had that done in the past, we would want to disclose it. A common thing that can intrude on a sewer line are roots from trees. There can also be sags from, anyone that's driven over it, if the ground settled after it was installed. There are some ways in which that it can deteriorate over time. Older cast iron pipes that were used in older construction, those tend to, with age, deteriorate, and they're very susceptible to tree roots, whereas kind of newer PVC or other material pipes tend to be more resistant to that. But there are fixes. Have you had it inspected? If you have, we need to disclose. If you have a septic tank and you have a leach field, we're going to have some questions about that. Our team will go to the town and we'll see if we can find a design that's on file. And we're going to want to know if you've had any problems with it. Have you had it replaced? Have there been any times where there have been backups, or you've been advised by someone that you need to have something completed? We're going to want to know that, because what is that? A septic system is something we think of as a big ticket item. If it fails, it could cost someone a lot of money, so we're going to want to share with them anything we know about it. We're also going to want to disclose the last time you had the septic tank pumped. There is a rule of thumb that you should have the septic tank pumped, and it depends on how many people live there. And what I've been told is, if you take the number 6, meaning 6 years, and you subtract a year for every person that lives in the house. So if you only have one person living in the house, you're probably using the system lightly. You can get away with going 4 or 5 years between pumping your septic system. If you have a lot of people, if you have 4 people using the house, you might want to have it done every 2 years. If you have higher use and you're using it more than that, you might want to do it every year. It depends on what your septic system is rated for and how much you're using it. And those are other things that we're going to tend to disclose on our disclosure, is how many people are using the house and what is the overall utilization. Next section, heating. What are the different heating sources? You might have more than one heating source for your home. Typically, you'll either have a boiler or a furnace, hot water that gets heated and goes through the pipes and through the registers and the radiators in your house, or a furnace which you have ducts and the hot air comes up through usually the floors or the ceilings. Those are the two most common. There are also mini splits, which are heat pumps that sometimes you can have a heat pump that goes through ductwork. Other times you have them hanging with those big registers on the wall. Or we might have fireplaces, wood stoves. You might have electric heat registers on the bottom of your wall. All of those heating sources that we need to list and share with people so they know what they are. And here's one that people sometimes don't know the answer and we might need to research. We're gonna ask, how much fuel did you use for each heating source over the last 12 months? Why do we do that? We do that so a buyer can build it into their budget. So we're gonna ask how many, if you have a oil-fueled forced hot water system, we're gonna wanna know how many gallons of heating oil did you use last year? Then a buyer can look at what today's oil price is, how much you used last year, and get an estimate of what that would cost. Same goes if you have propane or kerosene. With electric, it's sometimes harder, so sometimes we ask for you to share specific month bills. We might look at your February electric bill and see kind of what was that if you're heating your house with electric sources. If you have chimneys, if you have fuel lines that run from the tank to the system, we're going to have questions about that. We're going to want to know when chimneys were last cleaned, whether or not they're lined, and whether that fuel line I mentioned has a sleeve and whether it's buried. Those are things we share. The next section has to do with hazardous materials. And now, what is a hazardous material? We have a list of the specific ones the state asks you about, but if there's anything else that you think would impact people's safety or their health, that is something to disclose. Number one is underground storage tanks. We're not talking about the septic tank. We're saying, was there ever a storage tank, usually for fuel, but could have been for other things, on anywhere in the premises? If you don't know, we say unknown. But if you know that there was one, or you know it was removed or filled in or anything else, we need to share that. Number two is asbestos. And asbestos was a material that was used in a number of ways for insulation, for building materials, for siding. So we ask you, is there asbestos in the ceilings, in the siding, on the roofing, on the flooring, or anywhere else? Common place that we find it in older homes is on heating pipes. And that's going to be something that when I come to your house and we're getting ready, I'm going to do a visual inspection and see if I see it. Sometimes in a certain age home, if you have kind of a 1 foot by 1 foot tile on your floor, I might say, hey, there might be asbestos in these floors. Now, if we don't know, we don't have to say, yes, it's there, but it is always helpful for us to flag it and say, hey, it might be there. We generally know that if you have a newer home, there's a high likelihood there's no asbestos in the house, and so we can have high degree. But if we're talking about a house that was built before 1970 and there are older materials in there, we're going to take a much closer look. The next topic is radon. Radon is a gas that is a byproduct of the breakdown of the rocks in the Earth's crust, and we have a lot of radon in Maine. We find it in the air, we find it in the water. If you've had your air or water tested for radon, we need to disclose what those results were. Was it satisfactory or was it elevated? And that's a disclosure item. A few years ago, the state of Maine added a disclosure question about methamphetamines. It always gets a laugh when I ask people, is there a history of meth at your property? But in the event that there was, it must be disclosed. If not, we say no or unknown. And finally, lead-based paint. Lead-based paint is only for homes that were built prior to 1978 when they stopped allowing lead to be an additive to paint. And if you know anything about lead, if your house is built before 1978, we'll have a whole separate addendum we have to fill out, letting people know whether or not you have any records about it. But essentially, it's a health hazard. It can, when ingested, it can affect the nervous system. And so we want to make sure that that's disclosed. If it's been painted over, if it's been encapsulated, largely, we don't see it present a lot of challenges in a sale, but if there's visible flaking paint in an older home, this is going to be a big question. And finally, there's a catch-all category for any other toxic materials, landfills, radioactive material, or anything else you know. If there's something that you're thinking of that wasn't on this list, like if you know of mold or something else, disclose, disclose, disclose. Next, we talk about any deeds, easements, right-of-ways, rights that other people have on your property. Examples include, CMP, the power company, might have an easement across your property. We're going to ask, is your road public or private? That's something that people are going to want to know. If it's a private road that there's a road maintenance agreement for with your neighbors, or there's no road maintenance agreement in place, but it's privately owned by you and some of your neighbors, we need to know that so that a buyer can do due diligence, make sure they are comfortable with what it is. If you get any tax exemptions, examples are tree growth, open space, farmland, veterans exemption, homestead exemption. Now, a lot of times I'm going to be able to know that from looking at the tax records, which I can grab from the town or the city, and we'll look and see whether they list any. But if you know that you're getting them, why is that important? Well, we want any potential buyer that wouldn't qualify for that same exemption to know that that's why the taxes are what they are, and be on notice that if they don't get that exemption, their taxes are going up. Flood insurance. Do you have flood insurance? If you never have, if you're not near a body of water, if you're not in a floodplain, probably not an issue. If you do have flood insurance or you think you might need it in the future, that's something we want to tell a buyer. There's a question about equipment. Is there any equipment that you don't own? So things that are currently connected to the property, but they're not yours. Common examples are propane tanks. Oftentimes, the company that services and fills the propane tank actually owns that tank. So if Pit Stop is your servicer, we're going to disclose that they might own that tank. If their name is on the side of the tank, chances are they're the ones that own it. There are propane tanks and other fuel tanks that you own yourself, and so that's not an issue, but in the event that it's owned, that's something. Satellite dishes and direct TV dishes, those used to be a common example. Those companies rarely want them back afterwards. Sometimes there are water systems or other mechanical components of your house that you might be leasing rather than owning, and if those exist, we need to share them. Now, here are some structural ones that we care about. Number one is the roof. What year was the roof last replaced? If you don't know, we put unknown. If you know it was before you bought it, but you don't know what year, we do that. If you happen to know, we share that information. If the roof was recently done, this is going to be something that is in your favor, right? Disclosing doesn't just mean you're giving people negative information. It can be positive information. If you replaced your roof last year, this is going to be something that's a selling point. It's a relatively new roof that we're going to imagine is in good condition as long as it was installed properly. You also need to share whether there's any history of water, moisture, or leakage from the roof. That's important for a few reasons. Number one, if there was water or moisture damage that happened before you replaced the roof, there might still be staining or evidence of it, and we want people to know that happened before the roof was replaced. And people are going to want to know that you addressed whatever the source was that caused it, and that you went in and made sure it didn't cause any ancillary damage, such as mold. Mold in the attic can be caused by leaks in a roof, and so if there was ever a history of it, a buyer might look closer to make sure that there's no extra damage as a result of that. Similarly, if any water makes it into your basement, we're going to have to talk about that on the disclosure. We'll need to let a buyer know, is there a sump pump? Is there a history of water either before you own the property or since you've owned the property? And is there anything else that you've experienced with respect to water entering the home? Mold. Have you ever had the property tested for mold? I know I mentioned it separately over in the toxic and hazardous thing. We can mention the same thing twice at two different places because when in doubt, disclose. We want to make sure we have it on the form. If you've never had it tested, fine. If you have had it tested and you have the results, maybe I just had an example of a house where they did a test because they wanted to check. It came back with no mold detected. You can share that test result that there was no mold and the spot that was tested. Electrical. Do you have fuses or circuit breakers? Overwhelmingly, most properties have been updated so that they have circuit breakers, but if you have an older electrical system, updates might need to be made either before we sell it or before someone's able to get insurance once they buy the property, so we want to make sure that that's disclosed. The disclosure also asks what year your home was built, whether it's ever been surveyed. You don't have a requirement in Maine to have your house surveyed before you sell it, but if it has been surveyed and a survey is available, we like to share that. Wanted to know if it's a mobile home or if it's a manufactured home, so that knowledge is shared. And there's a new question, the most recent question added to the State of Maine Property Disclosure asks about pests and insects. Are there any known defects or hazardous materials caused by insect or animal infestation inside or on the residential structure? So let's talk about that pest issue for a second, because I think it's important. In Maine, that's really common, right? When the winter months, it gets cold, there are rodents and other animals or insects that try to find their way into your house. That doesn't always mean that there's a defect or a problem, but if you know about it, if you're setting out traps for mice or rats or rodents or something, then we should disclose it. If you've had bats in the attic, if you have even ladybugs that come in. Now, sharing this information doesn't necessarily scare away some buyers, but it puts them on notice and it makes it less likely they're going to come back and say there was something you knew about that didn't share with them. So we want to share that. And finally, there's just this catch-all category that wants to know, are there any other material defects about the physical condition or the value of the property, including those that may have an adverse impact on health and safety? You've been asked now. You've been asked to share anything you know, and you have an obligation under the law to share any material information you know. Now, is it possible that there are defects or things that you don't know about? Of course, you can't share information if you don't know it. That's fine. And there's no obligation to go find it out. But if you know, we have to disclose. Oftentimes this can feel overwhelming, but I promise you that as we fill it out together, you're going to find that you know most of the information on here, and there might be 2 or 3 items you need to research. And that's why we like to do this work ahead of time. We don't want it to be a last-minute scramble. We want to give you the time that you need to make sure that you're properly filling out your disclosure and living up to your obligation under the law. And our team will help you through that process to make it less overwhelming, more manageable, and help you meet your obligations under law. That's why if you're thinking of selling your house, our team would love to be the one that helps you. For Demetria's team, the real estate group, this is Aaron Chadbourne.